Tonggo. So, 9 Ngay. Guay 26. 04. 2026. Foot 65. Sungling. Agate. T. P. S. Dois pontos barra. Barra W. www.youtube.com barra. Watch ponto de interrogação V sinal de igual I 5BHTIS, J1 ou IT sinal de igual 12S. Thieu, de. My parents disowned me at 13 unaware that 15 years later they'd be begging at my door. Kirban hoalam 65. My name is Amira Stone. I'm 28 years old, and the people sitting across from me in that quiet glass conference room were the same people who threw me out like garbage when I was 13. And now, 15 years later, they were here smiling, dressed in black like they were grieving, but their eyes were not sad, they were calculating, watching the envelope in the lawyer's hand like hungry people staring at a locked door full of money. My mother even brought her own attorney, as if she had already decided how this story would end, as if she had already rehearsed her victory before the first word of the will was even read. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my uncle had been preparing for this moment for years. And when the truth came out, it didn't just break their expectations, it destroyed them completely. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I need to take you back, because nothing in that moment makes sense unless you understand what it feels like to be the child your own parents decided was not worth keeping. I grew up in a small house in southeast Portland. Nothing special, peeling paint, uneven grass, the kind of place where people say, we don't have much, but we have each other. Except in my family, that wasn't true. We didn't have much, and we didn't have each other either. My mother, Lydia Stone, believed love was something you invested carefully, like money, and she chose to invest everything in my sister Vanessa. Vanessa had her blonde hair, her bright smile, her confidence. She was the version of my mother that the world could admire. And me, I was the quiet one, the one people forgot to compliment, the one who learned early that silence can hurt more than words. I remember one birthday, Vanessa's 15th. The house was full of laughter, music, people, a beautiful cake, cameras flashing, my mother glowing like she had achieved something important just by standing next to her daughter. 3 months later, on my birthday, we sat around the kitchen table with a leftover cake that didn't even have my name on it, and I told myself it didn't matter. But deep down, I already knew. I was not the child they were building a future for. I was just there. Everything changed the summer I turned 13. I got accepted into a science program, a full scholarship, something I had worked for quietly, without telling anyone, because hope was something I had already learned to keep to myself. For a few hours, I felt something I had never truly felt before, like maybe I mattered. Then my sister wanted to go to an arts camp, and suddenly, my future became negotiable. At dinner that night, my mother didn't ask, she decided. You're going to decline your program, she said calmly, like she was choosing what to cook. And something inside me broke, but also woke up. For the first time in my life, I said no. And that one word cost me everything. 3 days later, I came home and found my life packed into 2 garbage bags sitting on the porch. My mother stood in the doorway, calm, cold, finished with me. From now on, she said, you're someone else's problem. My father stood behind her, silent. My sister watched from the window, silent. And I sat on that porch for 4 hours in the dark, trying to understand how a child becomes disposable in her own home. That night, my uncle came. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge me. He just hugged me and said something no one had ever said to me before. You have a home now. And that was the first time in my life I believed it. We'll see where this goes. The call ended there, just like that. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a quiet agreement to try again, carefully, slowly, like walking across thin ice where one wrong step could send everything crashing back into the past. After I closed the laptop, I sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of myself on the dark screen, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the girl sitting on that porch with 2 garbage bags anymore. I saw someone else. Someone who had survived long enough to choose what stays in her life and what doesn't, and that was something no inheritance could ever give me. Because the truth is, the money, the properties, the accounts, all of it, it changed my circumstances, but it didn't define my peace. My peace came from something much harder to build: boundaries. And understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away without needing anyone to apologize properly. But life has a way of testing you, even after you think the hardest part is over. 3 months after that first call with Vanessa, something unexpected happened. I received another message. Not from Lydia, not from Calvin, but from someone I hadn't thought about in years. It was from an old neighbor back in Portland. Her name was Mrs. Holloway. She used to live 2 houses down from us, a quiet woman who always watered her plants in the morning and watched everything without seeming like she was watching anything at all. Her message was short. Amira, I don't know if you remember me, but I saw something years ago that I think you deserve to know. I stared at that message longer than I should have. Because there's something about the past. When it comes knocking again, it rarely brings something light. I replied. What did you see? Her answer came the next day. And it changed something inside me that I didn't even know was still waiting for answers. She told me that the night I was thrown out, I wasn't the only one watching. She had been at her window. She saw me sitting there. She saw my mother come out twice, not to check on me, but to make sure I hadn't left yet. And then she said something I wasn't prepared to hear. There was a man who came to the house before your uncle arrived. I felt my chest tighten reading that line. A man? Who? She didn't know his name, but she described him: tall, wearing a dark jacket, carrying a folder. He stayed inside for about 20 minutes. Then he left, and only after that, my uncle arrived. For a moment, everything in my memory shifted slightly, like a picture that had been straight for years suddenly tilting just enough to feel wrong. Because I had always believed that night was simple. Cruel, but simple. They threw me out. My uncle came to get me. That was it. But now, there was something else. Something I hadn't seen. Something that happened behind that door, while I was sitting outside in the dark thinking my life was over. I called Margaret Lawson the next morning. Do you still have the full file from 2010? I asked her. She paused for a second. I can get it, she said. Why? I think there's something missing, I replied quietly. 2 days later, I was back in her office. Same building, same glass walls, same gray sky outside. But this time, it felt different. Like I wasn't just closing a chapter anymore, I was uncovering something that had been hidden from me the entire time. Margaret placed a thicker file in front of me than before. This is everything we have, she said. I opened it slowly. Page after page of legal documents, timestamps, signatures, official records, and then I found it. A document I had never seen before. It wasn't part of the guardianship transfer. It was separate. Attached to the same date. July 15th, 2010. My fingers tightened slightly as I read the title. Conditional Financial Agreement. I felt something cold run through me. Because suddenly, that night didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like a transaction. I looked up at Margaret. What is this? She leaned forward, reading over my shoulder. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked surprised. This, she said slowly, shouldn't be here. My heart started beating faster. Why? She exhaled slowly. Because this wasn't filed with the court. I stared at the document again. The words blurred for a second before I forced myself to focus. It stated that Victor Stone had agreed to take full guardianship of me, along with associated financial responsibilities, in exchange for a one-time payment. My hands froze. A payment. To my parents, for me. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, heavier. How much? I asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. She read the number again carefully. Then she looked at me. $50,000. For a moment, I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness. Because the question that had followed me my entire life, what did I do wrong, suddenly had a different answer. Nothing. I didn't do anything wrong. I was sold. And the worst part was that the man who paid that money was the same man who spent the next 15 years proving I was worth far more than that. I sat back slowly in my chair, and for the first time since the will reading, I felt something rise in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not grief, not pain, but something sharper, something clearer. Truth. Closure isn't when everything becomes beautiful, it's when you no longer need another answer, and in that moment I understood something that took me 15 years to learn. My life finally belonged to me, not to the people who once decided I was something they could give away, something they could remove from their lives as if I had never truly been part of it. And strangely, that realization didn't come with anger, it came with a kind of quiet that I had never felt before. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from the absence of noise, but from the absence of doubt. I didn't sit there long after the call ended. I stood up, walked into my office, opened my laptop, and went back to work. Not because I was ignoring what had just happened, but because I didn't need to stop my life anymore just to process something that no longer had power over me, and that was new for me, because for years, every memory of my past had demanded my attention, demanded my emotions, demanded an explanation, but now, for the first time, it didn't. The following days felt almost normal, in a way that surprised me. I attended meetings, reviewed financial reports, spoke with partners, signed documents, all the things that had become routine in my life, and yet beneath all of it, there was something different, something lighter, like a weight I had carried for so long had finally slipped off, without me even realizing exactly when it happened. And I think that's the part people don't talk about. Healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's so subtle that you only notice it when you realize something that used to hurt you doesn't anymore. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave the office, Elena walked in without knocking, something she had always done. She leaned against the doorframe and studied me for a moment before saying, "You look different," and I smiled slightly. Good different or bad different? She tilted her head. Free different, and I didn't answer right away, because she was right. I felt free in a way that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with success. It had everything to do with the fact that I no longer needed anything from the people who once defined my worth. "So what now?" she asked, stepping into the room and sitting down across from me. And I looked out the window at the gray Seattle skyline, thinking about everything that had led me here, everything I had survived, everything I had built. "Now I build something that has nothing to do with them," I said quietly, and that wasn't a reaction, it wasn't revenge, it was a decision, one that had been forming inside me for years, without me even realizing it. I started with the scholarship, the one I had mentioned during the will reading, but I expanded it because I realized I didn't just want to help students who needed financial support. I wanted to help the ones who felt invisible, the ones who had grown up believing they were less important. The ones who had learned too early that love in their homes came with conditions, because I knew exactly what that felt like, and I also knew what it meant when just one person chose to believe in you anyway. The weeks that followed were full: meetings with educational organizations, discussions with nonprofit partners, legal structuring, reviewing applications. It was a lot, but it was the kind of work that gave something back to me. Something deeper than accomplishment. It gave meaning to everything I had gone through, because for the first time, my past wasn't just something I had survived, it was something I could use to create something better for someone else. One evening, as I was going through the first round of applications, my phone lit up. Vanessa. I stared at her name for a few seconds before answering. "Hi." Her voice sounded softer than before, more careful. "Hi." We both paused. Not because we didn't have anything to say, but because we were both learning how to speak again, without the weight of everything that had happened between us. "I got accepted," she said after a moment, "into the program I told you about," and I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "That's good." She let out a small breath, almost like she had been holding it. "I know you don't like long conversations, so I just wanted to tell you that." I nodded, even though she couldn't see that either. "You're doing something for yourself. That matters." There was another pause. Then she said quietly, "Thank you for not cutting me off completely." And that made me stop for a second, not because it was emotional, but because it was honest, and honesty, real honesty, was something I hadn't heard from my family in a very long time. "This is still step one. I reminded her gently. I know, she said, and that was it. No promises, no expectations, just a small step forward, and sometimes, with relationships like that, a small step is all you can ask for. If you've made it this far and something in this story feels familiar to you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts, because sometimes the strongest connections come from shared experiences, even when we don't know each other. Time moved forward faster than I expected. 3 months after the will reading, the scholarship program officially launched. The first group of students was selected, and as I read through their stories, I saw pieces of myself in so many of them. Kids who had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. Kids who had learned to survive before they had the chance to simply grow. And for the first time, I wasn't reading those stories with pain, I was reading them with purpose. One morning, I received a short email from Margaret. The estate transfer is complete, just one sentence, but it marked the official end of something that had been unfolding for months. I looked at the screen for a moment, then closed the laptop. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just a quiet understanding that a chapter had finally closed. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. I stood in front of the shelf where Victor's photo still sat. I picked it up and looked at it for a long time. I did it, I said softly, not because I needed him to hear it, but because I needed to say it out loud. I had taken everything he gave me and turned it into something real, something lasting, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And in that moment, I realized something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. Family isn't always the place you come from. Sometimes it's the place you choose. Sometimes it's the people who choose you back when you need it the most. If this part of the story resonated with you, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Your perspective might help someone else see their own situation a little more clearly. I didn't hear from Lydia again after that call. Not another message, not another attempt. And surprisingly, I didn't feel the need to check. I didn't feel the urge to reopen that door, because I had already stepped through it and closed it behind me, not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity is something no one can take from you once you truly have it. A few months later, I received one final letter, not from Lydia, but from Vanessa, handwritten this time, and there was something about that, something about the effort, the intention, that made me read it more slowly, more carefully. She didn't ask for anything, she didn't make excuses, she simply told the truth, about that night, about the window, about how she watched me sit outside for hours and did nothing, and how that moment stayed with her all these years. I read that letter more than once, because it was the first time someone from my past had acknowledged what actually happened without trying to rewrite it. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. I didn't rush to respond. I took my time, because I had learned something important. Forgiveness doesn't mean immediate access. It doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. It means you decide what, if anything, deserves a place in your life now. Eventually, I wrote back, carefully, setting boundaries, clear, simple, non-negotiable, and when she responded with just one word, accepted, I knew that maybe, just maybe, something honest could exist there. Not the past, not what we were supposed to be, but something new, something built on truth instead of silence. And that's where I am now, not at the end of the story, because life doesn't really give you endings like that, but at a place where I finally understand my own story without needing to change it to make it easier to carry. Because the truth is, you don't always get the family you deserve, but you always have a choice in what you build after that. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that being left behind doesn't define you. What you choose to become afterward does. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Your presence here, your thoughts, your perspective, they matter more than you might realize. And if there's anything you take from this, I hope it's this. You are not what someone else failed to see in you. You are what you choose to grow into despite it. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story. But before I close this chapter completely, there's something I haven't told you yet. Something that didn't happen in the courtroom, didn't happen in a letter, didn't happen in a phone call, but happened quietly, in a moment that no one else witnessed, and somehow, that moment mattered more than everything that came before it. It happened on a Sunday morning, a few weeks after the scholarship program officially launched. The kind of Seattle morning where the sky is gray but the air feels clean, like the city has taken a breath overnight. I was in the office earlier than usual, going through a new batch of applications, reading story after story, each one carrying a different kind of weight, different details, different lives, but the same underlying question: am I enough? I paused on one file longer than the others. A girl, 14 years old, living with her aunt after being asked to leave her parents' home. Her grades were strong, her writing even stronger, but what caught me wasn't the achievements. It was one line in her personal statement: I don't want someone to save me. I just want someone to believe I'm worth saving. And for a moment, I couldn't move, because that sentence didn't just belong to her, it belonged to a version of me I had almost forgotten. The version that sat on a porch in the dark trying to understand why she wasn't chosen. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes for a second, and realized something that felt both simple and overwhelming at the same time. I couldn't go back and change what happened to me. I couldn't rewrite that night. I couldn't make my parents choose differently. But I could be the reason someone else never had to sit in that same kind of silence, wondering if they mattered. And that was the moment everything truly came together. Not the will reading, not the documents, not even the truth about the money, but this quiet understanding that my story wasn't just about what I survived. It was about what I could create because I survived it. I approved her application that same morning, not because I felt sorry for her, but because I recognized something in her that I had once needed someone else to recognize in me. Later that day, I drove out to the first property we had renovated under the new program, a small building that now served as a transitional housing space for students who had nowhere stable to stay during their studies. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't large, but it was safe, and sometimes, safe is more valuable than anything else. I stood there for a while, watching a few of the students move in, carrying boxes, talking quietly, trying to make a new place feel like home, and I realized that this right here, was the real inheritance Victor had left me, not the buildings, not the accounts, but the ability to create something that outlives pain. Not bad, huh? Elena's voice came from behind me. I turned and smiled. Not bad at all. She walked up beside me, hands in her coat pockets, looking at the building the same way I was. You know, most people would have just taken the money and moved on, she said. I did move on, I replied. She glanced at me. You know what I mean. I did know what she meant, but I also knew something else. Moving on doesn't always mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes it means taking what happened to you and refusing to let it end there. We stood there in silence for a moment, not awkward, not heavy, just present. If you've ever taken something painful and turned it into something meaningful, I'd really like to hear about it, because those moments don't always get recognized the way they should. A few days later, I received an unexpected email. Not from Lydia, not from Vanessa, but from someone else entirely. The subject line was simple. I heard about your program. It was from Dr. Eleanor Price, the same woman from Seattle Children's Hospital who had been at the will reading. Her message was direct, professional, but there was something warm beneath it. She wrote about expanding the scholarship partnership, about creating a joint initiative to support not just education but mental health resources for students coming from unstable family backgrounds. And as I read through her proposal, I felt something shift again, because what started as one decision was already growing into something bigger than I had planned. I replied within the hour, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to what had been done to me, I was actively shaping what would come next. That night, I found myself back at home, standing in front of the same shelf, the same photo, Victor's quiet smile still there, unchanged. I picked it up again, something I had been doing more often lately, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. You knew, didn't you? I said softly, and in a way, I think he did. I think he knew that one day I would understand everything, not just the facts, but the choices, the reasons behind them, the weight of them, and I think he trusted that when that day came, I wouldn't let it turn me into something bitter. I set the photo back down carefully, because the truth is, I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply reached a point where their decisions no longer controlled mine. And that is a different kind of victory, a quieter one, but a stronger one. If you're still here listening, I just want to say thank you. not just for your time, but for your attention, because stories like this only matter if someone is willing to truly hear them. Weeks turned into months, and the routine of my life settled into something steady, not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded, intentional, and most importantly, Vanessa and I continued our calls, still short, still careful, but consistent, and consistency, I learned, is where trust begins, not in big promises, but in small actions repeated over time. She never brought up the past unless I did, she never asked for more than I offered. And slowly, that mattered. One evening, toward the end of one of our calls, she said something that stayed with me. "I used to think you were the strong one," she said quietly. I didn't respond right away. "And now?" I asked. She hesitated, then answered, "Now I think you just decided not to break." I smiled slightly, because maybe that was true. Or maybe I had broken a long time ago, and then learned how to rebuild myself piece by piece. Either way, I didn't need to define it anymore. I just needed to keep going. And that's where this story really ends, not with a dramatic conclusion, not with a perfect reconciliation, but with something more real: clarity, choice, and the understanding that your past may shape you, but it does not get to own you. So if you take anything from this, let it be this: you are not what someone failed to see in you, you are what you choose to become after that. Take care of yourself, hold on to what is good, let go of what is not. And if you can, be the person you once needed. Because somewhere out there, someone is still sitting in the dark wondering if they matter. And you might be the reason they finally believe they do. Thank you for listening, truly, and I'll see you in the next story. But if I'm being honest, stories like this don't really end, they just soften, they become something you carry differently, something that no longer cuts every time you touch it. And I didn't realize how true that was until a few weeks later, on a quiet afternoon that didn't feel important at all until it suddenly was. I was at the office, nothing unusual, just another day of reviewing applications, answering emails, making decisions that used to feel heavy but now felt purposeful, and in the middle of all that, my assistant knocked lightly on the door and said there was someone downstairs asking to see me. No appointment, no explanation, just a name: Calvin Stone. For a second, I thought I heard it wrong, because after everything, after the will reading, after the call, after the silence, I didn't expect him to show up, not here, not like this. And my first instinct wasn't anger, it was hesitation, the kind that comes from stepping too close to something you thought you had already put behind you. "I can send him away," my assistant said carefully. I sat there for a moment, weighing it, not because I didn't know my boundaries, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't avoiding something out of old habit, out of that younger version of me that used to wait for answers that never came. "No," I said finally. "I'll come down." The elevator ride felt longer than it actually was, every floor passing quietly, giving me just enough time to steady myself, to remind myself that I wasn't walking into the same dynamic anymore. I wasn't the child looking up at him for approval. I was someone who had already built a life without it. He was standing near the reception desk when the doors opened, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him, not because he looked completely different, but because time had taken something from him. Something that used to make him seem solid, certain. Now he looked smaller, not physically, but in a way that's harder to explain, like a man who had spent too long avoiding something he could no longer ignore. He looked up when he saw me, and for a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "Amira," he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Calvin," I replied, keeping my tone even, not cold, not warm, just clear. He nodded slightly, like he wasn't sure how to stand, how to hold himself in this moment. And I realized something then. This wasn't a man coming to demand anything, this was a man who had run out of places to hide. "Can we talk?" he asked. I glanced toward the small meeting room off the lobby, then back at him, and nodded once. We sat across from each other at a small table, nothing formal, no documents, no lawyers, just two people who shared a history neither of us could change. He didn't speak right away, and I didn't rush him, because for once, I wasn't the one waiting for something, I was simply present, letting the moment unfold, without trying to control it. "I shouldn't have come," he said eventually, almost to himself. "Then why did you?" I asked. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, and there it was. Something I had never seen from him before. Not confidence, not indifference, but uncertainty. Because I realized something, he said slowly. Too late, probably. But I realized it anyway. I didn't respond, I let him continue. I thought staying quiet was easier, he said, his voice tightening slightly, that if I didn't argue, didn't push back, things would just settle on their own. A small, humorless smile crossed his face. They didn't. I watched him carefully, not searching for an excuse, just listening. I saw you that night, he said suddenly, and my chest tightened just slightly despite everything. On the porch, I saw you sitting there. I didn't move. I told myself, it wasn't my decision, he continued, that your mother had already decided, that it wasn't my place to step in, that things would work out somehow. He exhaled slowly. That's what I told myself for 15 years. Silence settled between us. Not heavy, just real. And now? I asked. He looked at me. Really looked this time. Not past me, not around me. Now I know that doing nothing was a decision. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Not because they fixed anything, not because they erased what happened, but because they were true, and truth, even late, even imperfect, has its own kind of impact. I'm not here to ask for anything, he added quickly. Not money, not forgiveness, not anything like that. I nodded slightly. Then why are you here? He hesitated, then answered in a way I didn't expect, because I didn't want the last thing between us to be I hadn't prepared for. Not because it was emotional, but because it was simple, and simplicity can be harder to dismiss than anything else. I leaned back slightly, considering that you already made your choice, I said calmly. 15 years ago. I know, he said immediately. No defensiveness, no argument, just acceptance. And I made mine, I continued. I built a life that doesn't include you. He nodded again. I can see that. There was no bitterness in his voice, no attempt to push against what I was saying, and for the first time, I realized this conversation wasn't about changing anything. It was about acknowledging what already existed. I don't hate you, I said, the words coming out steady, because they were true, but I don't have a place for you in my life. He closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. I understand. And surprisingly, he did. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. Didn't reach for anything that wasn't offered. Thank you for hearing me out, he said quietly. I nodded once. That's all this is. We stood at the same time, not coordinated, just naturally, like the conversation had reached its end, without needing to be forced. At the door, he paused, then turned back slightly. You did better than we ever could have given you, he said, and there was something in his voice that felt like truth, not praise. Not regret trying to disguise itself as something else. Just recognition. I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to, because I already knew. He left after that, just walked out of the building, no looking back, no dramatic moment, just gone. And I stood there for a second, watching the door close behind him, expecting to feel something more, something stronger, but all I felt was steady. No anger, no sadness, just steady. If you're still here, listening, I want you to think about something. Not every conversation brings closure. Not every apology changes things. Sometimes, closure is simply knowing that you are no longer the person who needed that apology in the first place. I went back upstairs, back to my office, back to the work that mattered now, and as I sat down, I realized that this was what moving forward actually looked like. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but carrying it in a way that no longer controls you. And that's where this story truly settles, not in a perfect ending, not in a complete reconciliation, but in something far more real. A life rebuilt, a truth accepted, and a future chosen, deliberately, without fear, without waiting for someone else to decide it for you. So wherever you are in your own story, whatever you're carrying, whatever you're still trying to understand, remember this. You don't have to go back to be whole. You don't have to fix what was broken by someone else. You only have to decide what you will build next, and that decision is always yours. Thank you for staying with me through this Truly, and if this story meant something to you, even in a small way, I hope you carry that with you, and I'll see you again, in whatever story comes next. And I'll see you again, in whatever story comes next. But even as I said those words, I knew there was still one more quiet layer to unfold. Not because the past was pulling me back, but because life has a way of bringing you moments you don't plan for, moments that don't ask permission before they arrive. A few days after Calvin left my office, I found myself thinking less about what he said and more about what I felt during that conversation, or rather, what I didn't feel. There was no anger rising, no urge to go back and re-examine every detail, no need to prove anything. And that absence, that quiet steadiness, told me more about my healing than any dramatic reaction ever could. I returned to my routine: meetings, site visits, reviewing the next phase of the scholarship expansion, everything moving forward with a kind of clarity I hadn't known before. And then one afternoon, as I was walking through the transitional housing building we had renovated, one of the students approached me. She looked nervous, unsure if she should even be speaking to me, and I recognized that feeling instantly, because I had once been that exact version of uncertainty. "Hi," she said softly. "Are you the one who started this program?" I smiled gently. "I'm part of it, yes." She nodded, holding onto the strap of her backpack a little tighter than necessary. "I just wanted to say, thank you." It was a simple sentence, but the way she said it, the way her voice carried both relief and disbelief, made it land differently. "For what?" I asked. "For not asking me to explain everything," she said, "for just letting me be here." And in that moment, I understood something even deeper than before. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer someone isn't solving their problems or fixing their past. It's giving them a space where they don't have to justify their existence. "You don't owe anyone an explanation to be here," I told her quietly. She nodded, and I could see something shift in her expression. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to matter. After she walked away, I stood there for a moment, looking around the building, the small rooms, the shared spaces, the quiet conversations happening in corners, and I realized that this place, this simple structure, held something I never had at that age: safety without condition. And somehow, that meant more than anything I had lost. If you've ever been given a second chance in a place you didn't expect, I'd really like to hear about it, because those moments often shape us more than the ones we planned for. That evening, I returned home later than usual, not because I had to, but because I wanted to stay just a little longer in that space. That feeling, that sense that something meaningful was actually happening, and when I stepped into my house, everything felt calm, familiar, mine in a way that still sometimes surprised me. I set my keys down, poured a glass of water, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. Not the kind of quiet that used to feel empty, but the kind that feels complete. My phone buzzed softly on the counter. "Vanessa." I hesitated for a second, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. These moments mattered now. Each conversation carried intention. "Hey," I answered. "Hey," she replied, her voice sounding a little more relaxed than before, a little less guarded. We talked for a few minutes, nothing heavy, just small updates: her training, her kids, a funny story about a client who couldn't sit still long enough for her to finish a manicure, and I found myself laughing, not forced, not polite, just naturally. At one point, she paused and said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant," she said. "About what?" I asked. "About building something that isn't tied to where we came from." I didn't respond immediately. "And how does that feel?" I asked instead. She let out a small breath. "Scary, but also lighter." I smiled slightly. "Yeah," I said. "That sounds about right." We ended the call not with anything dramatic, just a quiet talk soon, and that was enough. More than enough. Because not everything needs to be resolved in one moment. Sometimes progress is just continuing. As the weeks turned into months, life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still challenges, still decisions that carried weight, still days that required more energy than I felt like I had. But there was a difference now, a foundation that didn't shake every time something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I came across a familiar date in one of the documents: July 15th, 2010, and for a split second, I paused. The old instinct, the one that used to pull me back into that night, into that porch, into that version of myself, surfaced briefly. But then, something else happened. It passed, not because I pushed it away, not because I forced myself to ignore it, but because it no longer held the same weight. And that was something I never thought I'd experience. If you're still listening, I want you to know this. Healing doesn't erase your past, it changes your relationship with it. It turns something that once defined you into something that simply belongs to your story. Later that evening, I found myself once again standing in front of that shelf, the photo of Victor still there, unchanged, constant, a quiet reminder of where everything shifted. I think I get it now, I said softly. Not just what he did for me, but why. He didn't try to erase my past. He gave me a future strong enough to stand without it. And that's a very different kind of gift. I picked up the photo for a moment, then placed it back carefully, because I didn't need to hold onto it tightly anymore. It was already part of me. And that's where this story finally rests. Not in a perfect resolution, not in a world where everything was made right, but in something more honest, a life that continued, a past that no longer controlled it, and a person who learned, slowly, sometimes painfully, that worth is not something given to you by others. It's something you decide to carry for yourself. So wherever you are right now, whatever part of your story you're in, whether you're still sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to choose you, or you're already walking forward on your own, remember this: you are not the silence you were left in. You are not the decisions someone else made about you. You are the choices you make next. And those choices can change everything. Thank you for being here, for listening, for staying until the end. Your time, your attention, your thoughts, they matter more than you might think. And if this story gave you even a small sense of clarity or strength, then it has already done more than I could have hoped for. And I'll see you again in the next story, but before I truly step away from this one, there's a quieter truth I want to leave you with, something that didn't come all at once, something I had to learn slowly, through ordinary days that didn't look important at the time. Because after everything settles, after the conversations, the documents, the revelations, life doesn't pause for you to admire your strength, it just keeps moving, and you move with it, sometimes confidently, sometimes uncertainly, but always forward. A few weeks later, I found myself back in Portland for the first time in years, not because I had to be there, not because I was pulled back by anything unfinished, but because I chose to go, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. I drove through streets that once felt too small, too heavy with memories, and this time they looked different, not because they had changed, but because the house was still there. The same narrow structure, the same uneven yard, the same paint that never quite held its color, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. I didn't stop the car right away. I drove past it once, then again, not avoiding it, just giving myself time to notice what I felt. And what I felt surprised me. Nothing overwhelming. No rush of pain. No anger rising to the surface. Just a quiet recognition that this place was once part of my story, but it was no longer the center of it. Eventually, I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, watching the house the way someone watches a memory rather than a reality. And for the first time, I didn't see the girl on the porch. I didn't hear the silence of that night. I didn't feel the confusion that used to follow me. I saw something else. I saw distance. And distance can be a form of peace. I stepped out of the car, not to confront anything, not to relive anything, just to stand there for a second and acknowledge that I had made it out, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, completely. There was a woman in the yard next door, watering her plants. She glanced at me briefly, curious but not intrusive, and I wondered if she had been there all those years ago, if she had seen anything, if she remembered anything. But I didn't ask, because I didn't need to know. Not anymore. If you've ever gone back to a place that once hurt you and realized it no longer has the same power, I'd really like to hear about that moment, because those are the moments where you truly see how far you've come. I got back in the car after a few minutes and drove away without looking back. Not because I was trying to be strong, but because there was nothing there left for me to hold on to. On the drive back, I didn't think about what I lost. I thought about what I built. And that shift, that simple change in focus, made all the difference. When I returned to Seattle, everything felt familiar again. The office, the projects, the people who had become my chosen circle, the ones who showed up consistently, who stayed, who didn't need to be convinced to care. A few days later, we held a small event for the scholarship recipients. Nothing elaborate, just a gathering to welcome them, to give them a chance to meet each other, to feel like they were part of something rather than just passing through it. I stood at the front of the room for a moment, looking at them, different backgrounds, different stories, but the same quiet hope in their eyes, and I remembered what it felt like to not have that, to not have anyone standing in front of you saying, "You belong here." So I said it. "You belong here," I told them simply. No speech, no dramatic build-up, just the truth. And I could see it land, not perfectly, not instantly, but enough to matter. After the event, as people began to leave, one of the students approached me, a little hesitant, a little unsure. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things were different?" she asked. I considered that for a moment. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "And?" she asked. I smiled slightly. "And then I remember that I wouldn't be here if they were." She nodded, thinking about that, and I could see the question behind her eyes, the same one I used to carry. "Does it still hurt?" she asked quietly. I paused. "Not the same way," I said. "Then how?" I took a breath. "It doesn't hurt like an open wound anymore," I explained. "It feels more like a scar, something that reminds you of where you've been, but doesn't stop you from moving forward." She seemed to understand that, or at least part of it, and sometimes, part of it is enough. As she walked away, I realized something I hadn't put into words before. Healing isn't about becoming someone who was never hurt. It's about becoming someone who is no longer controlled by that hurt. If you're still here listening, I want you to remember this. Your past may explain you, but it does not get to limit you. That night, I went home, the same quiet routine, the same sense of calm, and as I stood in front of that shelf one more time, I didn't pick up the photo this time. I just looked at it. And that was enough. Because I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I wasn't looking for closure. I already had it. And that's where this story truly ends, not with everything fixed, not with every relationship restored, but with something more real. A life that is yours, a past that no longer owns you, and a future that you choose, every single day. So wherever you are in your story right now, whether you're still searching for answers or you're finally starting to move forward, know this. You are allowed to outgrow what once hurt you. You are allowed to walk away without explaining yourself. And you are allowed to build something better, even if no one who hurt you ever understands it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Your time, your attention, your presence, they mean more than I can say. And if this story gave you even a small sense of strength, then it has already done what it was meant to do. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing forward. And I'll see you in the next story. But before I let you go, there's one last quiet piece I want to share. Something that didn't feel important when it happened, but stayed with me longer than I expected. A few weeks after that visit to Portland, after the event, after everything had settled into its new rhythm, I received a message that didn't carry urgency, didn't demand attention, but somehow, I knew I shouldn't ignore it. It was from an unknown number. No name. Just a short sentence. "I think you deserve to know something about Victor." For a second, I just stared at the screen, not because I was afraid, but because I had already learned that the past doesn't usually return without a reason, and when it does, it rarely brings something simple. I almost didn't respond. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. I had reached a point where I didn't need more answers to feel whole. But then I thought about something Victor once told me. You don't have to go looking for the truth, but if it finds you, don't turn away from it. So I replied, "What is it?" The answer didn't come immediately. It came the next morning. And it was longer than I expected. The message was from someone who used to work with Victor years ago, a former business partner who had stepped away before I came into his life, and what he shared wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a hidden scandal or a shocking revelation. It was something quieter. Something human. He told me that Victor had struggled with the decision to take me in. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't know how to be what I needed. Afraid he would fail. Afraid that he would become just another adult who let me down. I read that part twice, because in all the years I had known him, I had never seen that fear. He had always seemed steady, certain, like someone who already knew exactly what to do. But apparently, he didn't. The message continued. It said that Victor had asked for advice. Not about money, not about legal responsibility, but about something much simpler. How do you show a child they matter when they've already been taught they don't? I felt my chest tighten slightly reading that line, because that was it. That was everything. Not the house, not the education, not the career. That question. That intention. That was what changed my life. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to choose. To stay. And he did. The message ended with a simple sentence. He never stopped worrying about whether he was doing it right. But he never once considered not doing it. I put my phone down slowly. And for a moment, I just sat there, letting that settle. Because sometimes, the people who change your life the most aren't the ones who feel the most confident. They're the ones who show up anyway. If you've ever had someone in your life who stayed when they didn't have to, I'd really love for you to share that, because those people deserve to be remembered more than anyone else. Later that day, I found myself walking through one of the buildings again, the quiet hum of people living their lives around me, doors opening, voices in the distance, small moments that didn't seem significant on their own, but together created something real. And I realized something I hadn't fully put into words before. Victor didn't just change my life. He changed the direction of everything that came after it. Because of him, I was here. Because of him, these students were here. Because of him, something that started as a single decision had become something that would continue long after both of us were gone. And that's what real impact looks like. Not something loud. Not something temporary. But something that keeps going. Quietly. Steadily. Through other people. Through other choices. Through other lives. That night, I went home. The same familiar space. The same calm that I had learned to appreciate instead of question. And I stood in front of that shelf one more time. This time, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because I understood something now that I hadn't fully understood before. He didn't save me. He believed in me long enough for me to learn how to save myself. And that's a very different kind of gift. If you're still here, still listening, I just want to say this clearly. You don't need someone perfect to change your life. You just need someone who chooses not to leave. And if you didn't have that, if you never got that, it doesn't mean your story ends there. It means you have the chance to become that person. For yourself, or for someone else. And that might be even more powerful. Because the truth is, we don't always get the beginning we deserve. But we always have a say in what comes next. And that is where your real story begins. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this. For listening. For feeling. For reflecting. Your presence here matters more than you know. And if this story gave you even a small sense of clarity or strength, then it has already done exactly what it was meant to do. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing forward. And I'll see you in the next story. But if you've stayed with me this long, then you already know that some stories don't end when the words stop. They continue quietly in the way you live afterward. In the choices you make when no one is watching. In the way you treat people who may never know what you've been through. Because that's the part no one really talks about. What happens after you've already healed enough to move on? What happens when life becomes ordinary again? For me, it started in small ways. I began noticing things I used to ignore. The way I spoke to people when I was tired. The way I reacted when something didn't go as planned. The way I handled silence. Because there was a time when silence meant something was wrong. When silence meant I had done something to deserve distance. But now, silence was just silence, and that difference mattered more than anything else. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting, nothing unusual, discussing expansion plans, budgets, timelines, the kind of conversation I've had hundreds of times before. When one of the younger team members hesitated while presenting, He stumbled over his words, lost his place, and for a brief second, I saw it in his face, that same fear. The fear of getting it wrong. The fear of being judged. The fear of not being enough. And without even thinking, I said quietly, "Take your time, we're not in a rush." It wasn't a big moment. No one else in the room reacted. The meeting continued, but I noticed the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly. And something about that stayed with me. Because that was it. That was how change actually happens. Not in dramatic speeches, not in big declarations, but in small moments where you choose not to pass on the pressure you once carried. If you're listening right now, think about this. What is one small thing you can do differently today that makes someone else feel just a little more safe? Because those moments matter more than you realize. That evening, I walked home instead of driving. The air was cool, the city quieter than usual, and I found myself thinking not about the past, not about what happened, but about who I was becoming now. And that question felt different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't urgent, it was open. When I got home, I didn't go straight to work like I usually did. I made dinner. I sat at the table. I ate slowly. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking ahead. I wasn't solving. I was just there. And maybe that sounds simple, but for someone who spent years trying to prove her place in the world, that kind of stillness is something you have to learn. A few days later, I received an update from the scholarship team. One of the students had been accepted into a university she didn't think she could even apply to. Her message was short. "I didn't think I was allowed to want this much, but now I do." I read that line more than once, because I understood it. That feeling of thinking you have to shrink your expectations to match what you've been given. That feeling of not wanting too much because you're afraid it will be taken away. And I realized something again. Helping someone believe they're allowed to want more. That might be one of the most powerful things you can do. If this part of the story speaks to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share what you've learned, because your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Time continued to move forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady. And somewhere along the way, I stopped measuring my life by what I had overcome and started measuring it by what I was creating. And that shift changed everything. Because when you stop defining yourself by your pain, you finally give yourself permission to grow beyond it. One night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Nothing special, just me, but I paused, because I realized something quietly, almost unexpectedly. I wasn't trying to be someone else anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to rewrite my story. I was just living it. And that felt like the most honest version of strength I had ever known. Not loud, not visible, but real. If you've made it this far, I want to say this to you clearly. You don't have to become someone completely different to move forward. You just have to stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. That's enough. That's always enough. And so this is where I leave you. Not with a perfect ending. Not with everything tied together. But with something better. A truth you can take with you. You are allowed to outgrow what once defined you. You are allowed to build something new without asking for permission. And you are allowed to be at peace, even if nothing in your past was fair. Thank you for listening, thank you for staying, and thank you for being part of this story. Take care of yourself, keep going, and I'll see you in the next story. And I'll see you in the next story. But before we part, there's one more layer I want to sit with you in, not because it's dramatic, not because it changes everything, but because it explains something deeper about what it really means to move forward. Because moving forward isn't a single decision. It's a series of quiet choices you make every day after that decision. And sometimes, the most meaningful ones happen when no one is there to witness them. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a small gathering, nothing formal, just a room filled with students, mentors, a few people from organizations we partnered with, and I almost said no at first. Public speaking was never something I chased. I had spent most of my life trying not to be noticed, trying not to draw attention to myself. But something in me said yes anyway. Not because I felt ready, but because I knew I didn't have to be perfect to show up. When I stood in front of that room, I didn't have a script. I didn't have something polished. I just had my story. And for a moment, I hesitated, looking at all those faces, wondering how much to say, how much to hold back. Then I remembered something. I had already spent years shrinking my story to make it easier for others to hear. I didn't need to do that anymore. So I spoke honestly. Not about the money. Not about the legal battle. But about the feeling of not being chosen. About the silence. About the moment you realize you have to choose yourself because no one else will. And as I spoke, I noticed something. People weren't reacting to the facts, they were reacting to the truth behind them. After it ended, a few people came up to talk. Nothing overwhelming, just small conversations. But one of them stood out. A young woman, maybe 19, stood there for a moment before saying anything. I thought something was wrong with me, she said quietly. I looked at her. For what? For not feeling like I belonged in my own family. I nodded slightly. Because I knew that feeling too well. There's nothing wrong with you, I said. And I meant it, not as comfort, but as truth. She nodded, her eyes a little clearer than before, and that was it. No big moment. No dramatic breakthrough. Just a shift. And sometimes, that's all it takes. If you're listening right now and you've ever questioned your place in your own life, hear this clearly. Your worth is not determined by where you started. It's shaped by what you choose to build from there. After that event, I walked out into the evening air, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, everything feeling calm in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not because life was easier, but because I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I wasn't trying to prove I deserved to be here. I already knew I did. And that changed the way I moved through everything. The way I spoke. The way I listened. The way I showed up. Not just for others, but for myself. Days passed, then weeks, and I found myself settling into a version of life that felt too steady. Not perfect, not without challenges, but no longer defined by what had happened to me. Instead, defined by what I chose to do with it. One evening, I sat down with a notebook, something I hadn't done in years, and I wrote a single question at the top of the page. What do I want my life to feel like? Not look like, not sound like, feel like. And that question changed everything. Because for so long, I had focused on building something that proved something. Proved I was enough. Proved I could succeed. Proved I wasn't what they thought I was. But now, I didn't need to prove anything anymore. So I answered the question differently. I wrote, calm, honest, meaningful. And then I built from there. If you're still here, take a moment and ask yourself that same question, not what your life should look like to others, but what it should feel like to you. Because that answer will guide you more than anything else. As time continued, I noticed something else. I wasn't telling my story the same way anymore. Not because I was hiding parts of it, but because it didn't define me in the same way. It became something I could share, not something I had to carry. And that difference is what freedom actually feels like. One night, as I turned off the lights and prepared to go to sleep, I paused for a moment, just standing there in the quiet. No noise, no pressure, no expectation, just stillness. And I realized, this was it, not a big ending, not a final resolution, but a life that felt like my own. Fully, completely, without needing anything from the past to validate it. If you've made it all the way here, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to wait for everything to be resolved to feel at peace. You don't have to fix the past to build a future. And you don't have to be chosen by others to choose yourself. That choice is always yours. Thank you for staying with me, for listening, for reflecting, and for allowing this story to exist in this moment with you. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing forward. And I'll see you in the next story. And I'll see you in the next story. But if you're still here, there's one last thing I want to sit with you in, not as a storyteller, not as someone looking back, but as someone who is still living this, one day at a time, just like you. Because the truth is, healing doesn't end at a certain point. It changes form, it becomes quieter, less visible, but still, present in the choices you make, when no one is asking you to explain them. A few months after that talk, after the scholarship program had settled into something stable, after life had found its rhythm again, I noticed something small but important. I stopped checking my phone in the mornings. Not because I was trying to be disciplined, but because I didn't feel the need to brace myself for anything anymore. There was a time when every message felt like it could carry something heavy, a demand, a disappointment, a reminder of something unresolved. But now, morning was just morning. And that shift, as simple as it sounds, meant more than any milestone I had reached before. One day, I decided to take a break from the office, not a long one, just enough to step away and see how it felt to not be needed for a few hours. I went to a small bookstore near the water, the kind of place that doesn't try to impress you, shelves slightly uneven, quiet corners where people sit longer than they plan to. I picked up a book without thinking too much about it, sat down by the window, and started reading. And somewhere between the pages, I realized I wasn't scanning for distraction. I was actually present. And that was new. Because for years, being still meant thinking too much. And thinking too much meant going back. But now, being still just meant being here. If you've ever had a moment where your mind finally stopped running back to something that used to hold you, you know how powerful that is. And if you haven't had it yet, it doesn't mean you won't. It just means you're still on your way there. As I sat there, watching people pass by outside, I noticed a little girl walking with her mother, holding her hand tightly, talking about something with excitement that only children seem to carry so naturally. And for a brief moment, I felt something I didn't expect. Not sadness, not longing, but compassion. For myself, for the child I used to be. And that was different. Because for so long, when I thought about that version of me, I felt pain, confusion, sometimes even frustration. But now, I felt understanding. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting, not erasing, but finally being able to look back and say, "You didn't deserve that," and truly mean it. I left the bookstore later than I planned, walking slowly, not rushing back to anything. And that pace, that choice to not hurry, I felt like something I had earned. Not given, earned. Days passed again, as they always do, and life continued in its steady way. Work, conversations, decisions, moments that matter, and moments that don't seem to, until you realize later that they did. One evening, Elena and I were sitting in the office after everyone had left, not working, just talking, something we didn't do often enough. She looked at me for a second, then asked, "Do you ever wish it had been different?" It wasn't a heavy question, but it was an honest one, and I didn't answer right away, because the answer mattered. "Sometimes," I said finally. She nodded. "Yeah, me too. About my own stuff." We both smiled slightly. Then she asked, "But if it was different, would you still be you?" That question stayed in the air a little longer, because it wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. I thought about it, not just for a second, but really thought about it. And then I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "And I don't think I would understand things the way I do now either." She nodded again. "That's what I figured." We didn't say much after that, because sometimes, once something true is said, there's nothing else to add. If you're still here listening, I want you to think about this. Not everything that shaped you was fair, but it still shaped you, and you get to decide what you do with that shape. That night, I went home. Same quiet, same calm, same life that once felt impossible. And before turning off the lights, I paused. Not because I was looking for something, but because I recognized something. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for closure. Not for answers. Not for someone to finally understand. I already had everything I needed to move forward. And that is what freedom feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain. So wherever you are right now, whatever part of your story you're in, whether you're still searching, still hurting, or already starting to rebuild, remember this. You don't have to rush. You don't have to force it. You don't have to become someone else overnight. You just have to keep choosing the next right step, and then the next, and then the next. Because that's how a new life is built, not all at once, but one decision at a time. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. For listening. For reflecting. For being here. Take care of yourself. Keep moving forward. And I'll see you in the next story. But if you're still here with me, there's something even quieter I want to leave you with. Something that doesn't sound dramatic, doesn't feel like a turning point, but somehow becomes one when you least expect it. Because after everything we've walked through together, the truth is, life doesn't reward you with a perfect ending. It gives you something else. Consistency. And that is where real peace begins. Months passed, not in a blur, not in chaos, but in a steady rhythm I had once thought was impossible. Mornings that didn't start with tension. Days that didn't feel like something might collapse at any moment. Nights that ended without replaying conversations in my head trying to figure out what I did wrong. One evening, I stayed late at the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to finish something without rushing. The building was quiet, lights dimmed, the kind of silence that used to make me uncomfortable, but now felt grounding. I stood by the window for a moment, looking out over the city, the same view I had seen so many times before, but something about it felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because I wasn't looking at it the same way. There was a time when everything I saw felt like something I had to catch up to, something I had to prove I deserved to be part of. But now, I didn't feel behind. I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I just felt present. And that presence, that ability to stand still without questioning your place, is something I don't think we talk about enough. If you've ever reached a point where you're no longer trying to prove yourself to people who never truly saw you, you know exactly what I mean. And if you haven't yet, it doesn't mean you won't, it just means you're still on your way. As I turned away from the window, I noticed something on my desk, a small envelope I hadn't seen earlier, no name on the outside, just placed there quietly, almost like it didn't want attention. I picked it up, opened it slowly. Inside was a folded piece of paper. And a short note, not from anyone I expected, not from my past, but from one of the students in the program. But I was one of the first people you accepted, and I just wanted to tell you that I got through my first semester. I almost gave up twice, but I didn't, because I kept thinking about what you said, that we don't have to prove we deserve to be here, we just have to keep showing up. I read that line again. Then again. Because sometimes, the things you say without thinking too much about them are the things that stay with someone else the longest. The note continued. I don't know if my life will ever be easy, but for the first time, I feel like it might be mine. I sat down slowly, holding that piece of paper. And for a moment, everything else faded. Not because it wasn't important, but because this was the part that made everything else make sense. All of it. The pain. The confusion, the years of trying to understand something that didn't have a fair answer, it led to this, to someone else not giving up, to someone else choosing to stay. And that realization was enough. If you're listening right now, I want you to remember this. You may never fully understand why certain things happen to you, but you can always decide what happens because of you. That's where your power is. That's where your story continues. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my drawer, not as a reminder of what I had done, but as a reminder of what was still possible, because the story didn't end with me. It continued through every person who chose not to give up, through every person who decided they were worth more than what they had been told, through every person who kept going, even when it would have been easier not to. That night, I left the office later than usual, the city quieter now, lights reflecting off the pavement. The kind of night that makes everything feel just a little slower, a little more real. I walked instead of driving, letting the air settle around me. Not thinking too far ahead. Not looking too far back. Just here. And as I reached my door, I paused for a second. Not because something was missing, but because nothing was. And that is something I never thought I would feel. If you've made it all the way here, I want to thank you. Not just for listening, but for staying. Because staying, even when things are difficult, even when things don't make sense, is what changes everything. So wherever you are in your own story, whether you're still trying to understand, still trying to heal, or already starting to build something new. Remember this. You don't need a perfect past to create a meaningful future. You just need to keep going. One step, one choice, one day at a time. And that's enough. That will always be enough. Take care of yourself. Be gentle when you can. Be strong when you need to. And never forget, you are allowed to build a life that feels like yours. Thank you for being here. And I'll see you in the next story. But before we truly close this one, I want to stay with you just a little longer, because sometimes the ending of a story isn't a moment, it's a realization that settles in quietly when everything else has already slowed down. Because after everything, life didn't become extraordinary, it became steady. And I learned that steady is something you have to grow into. A few weeks later, I found myself doing something I had never done before. I took a full day off. No meetings, no calls, no plans. At first, it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like I was forgetting something important, like there was something I should be doing instead of just existing. But I didn't fill the time, I let it stay empty. I went for a walk, not to clear my mind, not to think, just to walk. And somewhere along that path, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I wasn't trying to outrun anything anymore. Not the past, not the questions, not even the silence. I was just moving forward, at my own pace, and that felt different. It felt like something I had been working toward without realizing it. If you've ever reached a moment where you're no longer running from your past but simply walking forward, you understand how powerful that shift is. Later that day, I sat at a small cafe, watching people come and go, conversations overlapping, laughter in the background. The kind of ordinary scene that used to feel distant from me. There was a time when I believed I had to earn this kind of peace, that I had to prove something first, fix something, become something, before I was allowed to feel okay. But sitting there, I understood something clearly. Peace isn't something you earn, it's something you allow. And that was a different way of seeing everything. That evening, I went back home, the same quiet space, the same familiar rhythm, and as I walked through the door, I noticed something small. I didn't feel the need to check anything. Not my phone, not my email, not even my schedule for the next day. I just put my keys down, took a breath, and let the moment exist. That might not sound like much, but for someone who spent years waiting for something to go wrong, that kind of calm is everything. A few days later, I received another update from the scholarship team. One of the students had written a short message, not formal, not structured, just honest. I didn't think I would make it this far, but now I think I can go even further. I read that line slowly, because I knew exactly what it meant. Not just the words, but the shift behind them. The moment where doubt starts to loosen its grip. The moment where possibility begins to feel real. And I realized again, this is how change continues. Not in big, visible ways, but in quiet decisions people make every day. To keep going, if you're listening right now, I want you to think about this. What is one step you can take today that moves you forward, even slightly, because those small steps are what build everything else? That night, I sat down with my notebook again. The same question from before still there. What do I want my life to feel like? And this time, I added something new. Peaceful, even when things aren't perfect. Because that's the part I hadn't understood before. Life doesn't become perfect. You just become someone who can live inside it, without falling apart every time something shifts. And that is strength. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs recognition, but the kind that stays, quietly, consistently, through everything. If you've made it this far, I want to say this clearly to you. You don't have to wait until everything is resolved to feel okay. You don't have to fix the past to build your future. And you don't have to prove your worth to people who never saw it. You just have to decide that you are allowed to move for, to build something new, to live a life that feels like yours. That decision is where everything begins and everything continues. So this is where I leave you. Not with a perfect ending, but with something real. A life that keeps going. A story that keeps unfolding. And a person, you, who still has the power to choose what comes next. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. For listening, for feeling, for reflecting. Your presence here matters more than you think. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing forward. And I'll see you in the next story. And I'll see you in the next story. But if you've stayed with me until now, then you already understand that some endings don't close with a final scene. They settle into your life slowly, like something you no longer question. Because after everything, what I found wasn't a dramatic sense of completion. It was something quieter, something that took time to recognize. A life that finally felt like it belonged to me. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer trying to escape it. One morning, not long after, I woke up before my alarm, the room still dim, the city outside just beginning to stir, and for a moment, I lay there, not thinking about what needed to be done, not running through a list in my head, not bracing for anything, just present. And that presence, that simple ability to exist in the moment without needing to fix or anticipate anything, was something I had never truly experienced before. I got up, made coffee, and stood by the window, watching the light slowly change, and I realized something that felt both simple and profound. There was nothing I needed to prove today, nothing I needed to chase, nothing I needed to fix. I could just live it. If you're listening right now, ask yourself this gently, not with pressure, but with honesty. What would your life feel like if you stopped trying to prove your worth and simply allowed yourself to exist within it? That question stayed with me throughout the day. Not as something I needed to answer immediately, but as something I could return to, something I could grow into. Later, at the office, everything continued as usual. Meetings, conversations, decisions, the steady rhythm of responsibility, but I noticed something different in how I moved through it. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't overthinking. I wasn't trying to control every outcome. I was simply participating. And that shift changed everything. Because when you stop trying to control everything, you start experiencing things as they are, not as you fear they might become. In the afternoon, I stepped outside for a short break, something I rarely used to do, and as I walked down the street, I passed people who had their own lives, their own stories, their own struggles, and for the first time, I didn't feel separate from that. I felt part of it. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, human way, and that mattered. Because for so long, I had felt like I was standing outside my own life, trying to earn my place in it, but now, I was already in it, and that was enough. If you've ever felt like you were on the outside of your own life, trying to find your way in, I want you to know this. You're not outside anymore. You've always been part of it. You just needed time to see it. As the day ended, I returned home, the same familiar space, the same quiet that now felt like comfort rather than emptiness, and I moved through it without urgency. I cooked dinner. I sat down. I ate slowly. Not because I was trying to be mindful, but because I wasn't rushing to get to the next thing. There was no next thing that needed me immediately. And that freedom is something I had once thought only existed in theory. That night, before going to sleep, I stood in front of the mirror again, not searching for something, not evaluating, just noticing. And I realized something I hadn't fully said out loud before. I was no longer waiting for my life to begin. It had already begun. A long time ago. I just hadn't recognized it. If you've made it this far, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to wait for a perfect moment to start living your life. You don't have to wait until everything makes sense. And you don't have to wait for someone else to tell you that you're enough. You already are. Even now. Even here. Even in the middle of everything, you're still figuring out. Because life isn't something that starts after everything is resolved. It's something that happens while you're still learning. Still growing. Still becoming. And that's where you are. Right now. So take a breath. Give yourself a little space. And keep moving forward. Not perfectly, not quickly, just honestly. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. For listening, for reflecting, for allowing this story to exist with you. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing forward. And I'll see you in the next story.